Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I have what is probably the best performance at a chess tournament of all time. I did some Googling before the show, and the records differ on what the actual highest performance rating tournament is, because of course ratings change and have been inflated in the past 20 years. But this one, Fabiano Caruana, I think an over 3,100 performance rating at the 2014 Sinquefield Cup, and some of the best chess games I have ever seen. And to start with here, we're going to take a look at one of those best chess games ever between Fabiano Caruana and Levon Aronian in that tournament. Now, a lot of people, while this event was live, were giving a lot of credit to Fabi's opening preparation as a reason for why he was doing so well. And I want to talk about that as we get into this game here. So we start with e4, e5, Fabi plays knight f3, knight c6, and the oldest opening in chess, or almost, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez. We get a6, bishop a4, and normal stuff with knight f6. No Berlin this time. We get castles by white, bishop e7 by Levon, d3, b5, bishop b3, castles, and knight c3. So a normal closed Ruy Lopez position here, with Fabi opting for knight c3 rather than the slightly more common c3 when everybody has seen this kind of game plan before. Instead, we get knight c3. And with this move, Fabi is taking a more direct approach to controlling the d5 square. Of course, after c3, you can expect things like the Marshal with this move d5 by black. So that's the first sort of deviation from the main line of the Ruy. Of course, knight c3, also a very respectable move. Then we get d6 by Levon, normal stuff still, a3 by Fabi, controlling the b4 square, and hinting at a potential expansion over here later on. Now we see knight a5 for black, and another bonus of a3 is that our bishop has a little square to run away from this threat. Bishop e6 by Levon, and then here's where Fabi very much goes off the beaten path. So generally, you get knight d5 or the move b4 here from white. In this instance, though, Fabi does capture on e6, and we see f takes e6 in return by Levon Aronian. Now, why isn't bishop takes e6 as common? Well, for one, it allows black to control the center square d5 much more easily, and number two, it does open up this f-file, which can occasionally be useful for black. Now, what does white get in return? Well, of course, doubled pawns always come with certain inherent weaknesses, and we're going to see Fabi actually look to target those in the game. Now, b4 was played. We see Levon play knight to c6. Bishop d2 is still very normal. Now d5 by Levon, we see rook e1, and now queen d6 by Levon Aronian. And I chose this moment to pause because up to this point they had actually been following a game by Lenier Dominguez and Sergei Karyakin that was played earlier in 2013, of course this tournament in 2014. And I think we need to look at that game to understand Fabi's next moves in this current game. So far, we've had some pretty normal opening play. I'm sure both players were familiar with this game that they're following, a game, by the way, that was won by Sergei Karyakin with the black pieces. And so Levon is probably thinking, this worked well for Sergei. The plan seemed to make sense there. I'm going to do the same thing. But Fabi, I'm sure, had seen this game and actually came up with a pretty significant improvement over what Lenier Dominguez played. So in that game, Lenier chose this move h3. And this is a pretty interesting move because at first glance, you're not really sure what it's doing if you're looking at it from the perspective of the white pieces. But of course, the idea with h3 is generally to give one of these knights the h2 square. And in the Ruy Lopez, this is a very common idea. You get a knight to h2 so you can reroute it to g4. Now, how does this make sense with white's plan? Well, we already said these pawns are going to be a little bit weak because they're doubled, so it makes sense to reroute a knight here, get rid of this f6 defender, and combine some kind of attack on the king's side with threats against these pawns in the center. However, this didn't really work out for Lenier Dominguez, because in that game, Sergei played very, very well with knight d7. Now we get knight e2 by Lenier, perhaps again hinting at some ideas of attacking the center. Now a5 by black was played in the game. And after this move a5, it's very, very clear that whatever kind of play Lenier was hoping for on the king's side, it's going to be a bit overshadowed by Sergei being able to rip open the queen's side pretty immediately. And that's exactly what happens. Rook b1 was played in that game, takes, rook fb8, knight g3, but now black closes the center and invades on the a file. And black, of course, had a pretty significant advantage thanks to these center pawns controlling a lot of squares and activity down the a file. So Fabi took a look at that game and said, I can do better. And that's why, in this position, rather than the slower move h3, Fabi takes a very proactive approach to stopping Levon Aronian's plan on the queen's side. And he does so with a very counterintuitive move, knight a2. So what's going on with this move? Well, immediately, Fabi is increasing the pressure to the a5 pawn, and in fact, is just planning a very simple reroute to b3, ensuring that the queen's side is going to stay locked down forever. Levon Aronian plays this same preparatory move that we saw Sergei Karyakin play. The immediate a5 is potentially playable, but it does run into some tactics here. For example, knight back to c3 hits b5, rook fb8, and then there's stuff like knight takes e5 that Levon would have to look out for, with the idea of the bishop coming to f4 and pawn to d4 to follow. Maybe not a huge advantage for white, but definitely something you need to calculate. And so Levon, perhaps fearing this, does play the move knight f to d7, the same move we saw Sergei Karyakin play, and now queen e2 by Fabi. So very accurate stuff so far, all very much with the intent of stopping this move of a5. Now, queen e2 and a5 don't really seem to be that related to each other, so let's take a look at what happens again if a5 here. I think Fabi would simply capture. We get knight takes a5 because the bishop covers. Now ed5, ed5. Rook b1 is again a useful move, stepping off this diagonal and attacking the b5 pawn. Rook fb8, and it's just that same tactic that we saw earlier, except this time the knight is already defended. No need for bishop f4 tricks. White is just taking this pawn, and with it, getting a lot of activity down the center e-file. So far, Fabi's digression from Lenier's game has been knight a2, knight fd7, and again, queen e2 now. And with these moves, Fabi seems to have found a tactical way to keep this plan of a5 from happening immediately. And how is Fabi going to spend that time? Well, we'll see after the move d4. And so d4, of course, might not be the most intuitive move at first, but the idea is to negate these e takes d threats, pressuring e5, all in an attempt to get this a5 push through. Now we see rook e to b1 by Fabi. So some counterintuitive, mysterious rook moves here by Fabi, but when you understand what their purpose is, it's quite nasty what Fabi is doing here. He puts the rook on the e-file to make these threats, stopping a5. Levon closes the center, threatening to play a5 again. The rook has served its purpose, so now it moves to b1, and in turn pressures the b pawn, stopping a5 once again. Now we see knight b6 by Levon Aronian, trying to invade to these weakened squares, but this allows Fabi the time he needs to play knight c1 and knight b3, effectively shutting down Levon's play on the queen's side forever. And I would say this is the genius opening play that people were sort of talking about at the time. Fabi had clearly done quite a bit of work on this line in particular, and even similar lines, understood at its core that black needs to play this move a5 to get activity on the queen's side, and did everything in his power to stop that from happening, and has now succeeded. That being said, that is only stage one in this game. We've had a lot to talk about so far with just the opening play, and what has Fabi done with this opening skill? Well, he's gotten himself about a plus 0.3 advantage, according to my stockfish at least. So clearly the game is not winning yet, but Fabi so deeply understands the plan in this position that he knows now that a5 has been prevented, black is going to have a very, very difficult game. Because if you're not playing a5 here, what are you doing with the black pieces? Well, it's very natural that Levon Aronian's attentions were turned to the open f file. If Fabi is not going to let Levon play the move a5, if he has so directly positioned all of his pieces to prevent this from happening, well then Levon is going to switch sides of the board and starts with rook f7. Now we're going to get another subtlety by Fabi here. Once again, this rook served its purpose on the e file. Now it's not really needed on the b file with the knight stationed on b3. And so we see the move rook c1. And it took me a while to understand why rook c1 was played, but this is actually sort of a trap by Fabi. If Levon were to play the natural move rook a to f8, then Fabi is actually ready to break open the c file here. And now that Levon's rooks have been diverted to the f file, Fabi is going to have a pretty nice advantage with the opening of the c file and these slightly loose pieces. And that's why we see Levon, who's a very good chess player, playing rook d8 instead, with the idea of preventing any c4 or c3 breaks by Fabi by including some pressure down the d file. Now we see the move knight g5, hitting this rook, hitting this pawn. We get rook f6 by Levon Aronian, not quite ready to part with this bishop, perhaps fearing some of these dark squared weaknesses on the queen side. We get queen h5 now by Fabi, inducing a weakness with h6, and simply knight back to f3. And already, the opening pressure that Fabi has put on is really being felt. So no more are these days of the Lenier Dominguez-Sergei Karyakin game where white never really got off the ground on the king side. We saw Lenier immediately defending the b pawn, Sergei immediately getting active rooks on the a file, and pretty much the entire game happened on the queen side of the board. Now, Fabi's queen is already on h5, he's already induced a weakness with h6, and these pawns are already under some pressure. And that is the power of Fabi's opening. Even though he wasn't winning out of the opening, he maneuvered the game, steered the game into a position where white's plan is clear, direct, and very difficult to meet, and black's plan is a little bit lackluster. You can put these rooks on the f file, and Levon does do this, but what is your purpose on the f file? Not so clear. Now, for the third time in the game, the rook has served its purpose on c1, and now switches places to go back to f1. So if ever there was a game of mysterious rook moves, this was it, with the rook starting on f1, going to e1, b1, c1, and now back to f1. But when we look at them step by step, they do start to make quite a bit of sense. Now, of course, the rook simply defending this pawn on f2 and negating the pressure that Levon is putting on the f file. Now we're going to see the move rook 8 to f7 by Levon, and this one is a little bit over my head. I think perhaps Levon is looking to be able to play a move like bishop f8 if it's needed to defend, perhaps also giving the king an escape route. I don't fully understand it, but it's not a bad move according to the engine, and I will take the engine's word on that one. Perhaps also we'll see Levon has a g6 idea a little bit later, and it's nice to have the rook in front of the king then to be able to maneuver around. Now we get rook a to e1 by Fabi. This one is a little bit less mysterious to me. The rook not doing anything on the a file, it's just moving into the game. Bishop f8 now by Levon. Again, perhaps this is just the simple idea, although I don't really know how this occurred to Levon, but regardless, not a bad idea. Now we see the move h3 by Fabi, and this is the move that Fabi originally had diverted away from in Lenier's game. But we see that Lenier didn't really have a bad idea, it was just mistimed. Now, and only now, that Fabi has locked down the entire queen side, forced Levon to divert the pieces back to the king side, is Fabi playing these advancing aggressive moves like h3 to allow for maneuvers like knight h2 to g4. Now we see g6 by Levon Aronian, and again, I don't know how he came up with this idea, but if you look at this position for black, it's honestly quite difficult to come up with anything better. Knight c3 isn't really doing anything, and it might actually be captured by white. This knight, I guess you could try to reroute back into the game somehow, maybe some bringing it to b6, but again, it's not really with a purpose. It's tough to unify the black pieces here. And that's how Levon is playing these strange-looking moves like rook f7, bishop f8, and g6. That being said, the queen's attacked, so Fabi simply retreats back to h4. We see queen e7 now, hinting at the idea of some queen trades. Fabi just puts the queen back on g3 and says, you're going to have to defend this pawn for a while. Levon, though, is up to the task, plays bishop g7, indirectly defending it. And now we have what I'm going to call the move of the game. So Fabi first and foremost, has negated the entire queenside idea by black. No easy task. This was black's main plan, and this is generally how players with the black pieces are playing against this structure. And now, Fabi has slowly but surely diverted the rooks back over to the king's side. The bishop is already well placed. He's forced weaknesses with g6 and h6. This weakness he created early on with bishop takes e6. How do we pull the trigger now and launch our attack? I'm asking you, chat room. See if you can find the move here. See if you can find the move. Mousa says knight h2, not a bad idea, not a bad idea at all. Knight h2 does in fact maintain quite a significant advantage for white, but we'll see if Fabi has something else in mind. Knight e5, knight h4, knight g5. Okay, I don't know about this one. This one does seem to lose this piece. You get this little pin, but black's just going to step out of the way. What else? Knight h4 I also don't think makes the most sense. Black might actually be trying to play a move like g5 in just a little bit, gaining even more space perhaps. The c4 break has been suggested because the knight on c6 is hanging. I don't know if it's going to really work out though. You do have some work to do with controlling the c3 square. Bishop h6, knight h4, and as expected, nobody in the chat room is as good at chess as Fabi Caruana. I don't know why I thought you would be. That is sort of a high bar to cross. But Fabi, of course, activates the final piece on b3 now that it's served its purpose of preventing the move a5. And that's really been the theme of the game here. Fabi using his pieces for very direct, very important purposes, and realizing that once that purpose has been fulfilled, there's something better they can be doing. We saw this rook get improved 4 different times early in the opening, all with really strong effects. And now, of course, we see this knight get into the game by playing knight a5. So what's going on here? Well, this knight is a really important defender of the e5 pawn. This knight was doing nothing on b3 aside from stopping a5, which now isn't really that important with all the pieces on the king's side. So of course Fabi is looking to trade this piece for the defender on c6. Now those of you with keen tactical eyes might realize that after knight takes a5, b takes a5, this pawn is hanging. And those with even keener tactical vision will realize that perhaps black can sacrifice a rook here, go king h7, and then play for these weaknesses on the queen's side, right? We've gotten rid of a lot of the punch in white's attack by getting rid of this knight, and you know, now the queen's side, there are weaknesses to be dealt with here. Bishop b4 can be met by c5, and maybe black's back in the game. And you would be totally correct, which is why we see Fabi playing knight takes e5 in this position. And this is the idea that makes knight a5 so strong. White is now playing up 2 pieces because these 2 knights are not impacting the board at all. Levon does decide to save this knight in light of the fact that if white is able to take on a5, then white isn't sacrificing anything and is still up a ton of pieces effectively. So knight b7, and now simply knight g6. Fabi's not interested in settling for this lowly rook on f7. We're going to take on g6 and keep up the pressure. Now queen d8 by Levon Aronian, and e5 by Fabi, rook f5, and now simply f4. And once again, Fabi is effectively playing up 2 pieces here, with these 2 knights just simply not in the game. I guess effectively up 1 piece, because technically Fabi does happen to be down a piece, if you count this bishop and these 2 knights. By the way, bishop's not contributing a whole lot either. And now we see the move c5 by Levon Aronian, which is a good of try as any. You need to get these knights back into the game somehow, and so far they are lacking in legal chess moves that don't immediately hang them. Now we see knight h4 by Fabi, and he's simply going to push the pawns forward, continue attacking weaknesses, and win the game in style. Knight back to f3 after rook h5. Once again, the knight did its job by careening through black's position and taking off the pawns. Now it comes back in a more supporting role for the pawn on e5. King h7, queen g4, hits the rook and the pawn, so rook h to f5. And now once again, knight to h4, and this rook is simply trapped. King h8, Fabi does capture the rook. Now, effectively, Fabi has sacrificed two pieces for one rook, but those two pieces are sitting on a4 and b7. So basically up a rook here for Fabiano Caruana. Queen g6 now, and you can't stop the pawn storm, and this game is just over. Queen e7, g4, rook f8, f5, queen e8. No danger here for Fabi, simply trades, f6, bishop f8, and now even f7 is good enough. Fabi finding the accurate tactical finish after rook e7, rook f6, knight b6. Finally, these knights are about to enter the game again, but bishop takes h6 is good enough to win. We see knight to d7 in the game, and just a few more moves. Rook e to f1. Knight f6 is not going to get the job done after bishop f8. When this endgame is hopeless for black, just 3 connected pass pawns for white is going to be enough. So instead we see c takes b4 by Levon, a takes b4, bishop h6, rook h6 check, king g7, and rook h5 was enough for a resignation from Levon Aronian. Of course, white's next 2 moves are rook g5 and rook g8, and then the game once again is going to be over. And rook takes f7, by the way, is met by, I think, rook h7 first, and then rook f7. Picking up the knight, and actually both knights, with the knight on b7 being totally trapped. So this, I claim, is one of the best games of chess ever played, and I just want to take you through step by step what happened again. So once again, of course, Fabi has fantastic opening play, and you see that here with this move, knight to a2. Such a deep understanding of the position to realize that preventing a5 at all costs is going to give white an advantage in this position. Black stuck to the normal plan, following the path that Sergei Karyakin had laid out in a previous game. But now after d4, the center is locked down thanks to this pressure by Fabi. We see him ensuring that a5 never gets played with knight b3, and this rook completes its journey to c1, and then eventually over to f1. And the rest is history. Fabi just launches this stunning attack on the king side, and that's not opening preparation. That's just Fabi being a chess genius. By the way, essentially perfect play during this attack by Fabi, and the star move of the game, of course, knight a5, activating the final piece for Fabi and sacrificing it in glorious style. So questions on this game, because it is quite a game. It is quite a game. Questions before we move on, chat. Exquisite Corpse says the problem with doubled e-pawns isn't the weak pawns, it's the weak squares. And I guess you could argue that g6 has been really weakened by this pawn being an e6. I would also argue that this pawn being weak is a very large contributing factor to why Fabi won this game. So I don't know if it's fair to say one over the other, but definitely both were important in this game. What opening? The Ruy Lopez, George. It was the Ruy Lopez. All right, let us move along to the second game I want to look at, which is a game between, of course, the world champion Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces against Fabi Caruana. So a little bit more on the tournament history here. Fabi actually started the tournament with 7 points out of 7. And then I think he decided enough is enough, and he kind of coasted in those last 3 games with 3 pretty easy draws to round out his tournament. But 7 out of 7 to start with involved beating the world champion with the black pieces, and that's what we're going to look at now. By the way, 7 out of 7 against the world's best, a feat not accomplished by many players. I think Bobby Fischer may be the only one with comparable streaks. But anyways, let's take a look here. Magnus plays e4. We see Fabi play e5 and bishop c4. So by this point, I might be wrong in this, but I think Fabi was already on a little bit of a tear here. I don't think this was like round 1 or 2. I think Magnus had seen Fabi's doing pretty well. But Magnus, being Magnus Carlsen, was not about to play some quiet game, and really went after Fabi here. So we get knight f6, d3, and now c6 by Fabi. And this is generally the problem with the bishop's opening by the world champion. What's the difference between the bishop's opening and the Italian? Well, you see in this position, thanks to the pressure on the e5 pawn, black has already been forced to make a move that defends the pawn. Whereas with the bishop's opening that we see here, we see Fabi being the aggressor as far as knight moves that attack center pawns. And now thanks to this extra tempo that black has saved by not defending e5, we see the immediate c6, and black is able to break in the center much more easily and much more freely than in the normal Italian. The game does continue with knight f3, and now we see d5. And traditionally, it's thought that once black achieves this move against this bishop's opening, it's more or less easy equality for black. We see bishop b3 in the game. We get a bishop b4 check, c3, and bishop d6. And it's pretty easy to understand why it's thought that black has equalized in this opening. All of black's pieces are going to have pretty natural squares. Black is not going to have any less space in the center and hasn't really created too many weaknesses to speak of. So let's see how Magnus was aiming to shake up the game here. So we get bishop g5, applying a little bit of pressure to these light squares in the center. Fabi simply takes on e4. We get d takes e4, and now h6, forcing this bishop away. And now queen e7. So stepping off the d file, and again, shaping up to be a pretty calm game here. Black is going to develop this bishop, play knight bd7, play rook d8, of course castle at some point, and it looks like major piece is probably going to get traded on the d file. It's going to be one of those quiet games that you've actually probably seen in the World Championship match between these two players. Instead, though, we get knight bd2, knight bd7, so far so normal. Bishop g3, bishop c7, pretty normal move, stepping off of the loose d6 square on the open file. We get castles, and now Fabi's claim to play for more than equality comes with this move, knight h5. So what's going on with knight h5? Well, Fabi's going to take off this bishop, and then because these are two 2800 players, he'll say, bishop pair, I win, and then Magnus will resign. So that's almost what happens. Instead, we get h3, knight g3, fg3, and knight c5. Now, what do you think Magnus Carlsen decided to play after knight c5? What did Magnus Carlsen decide to play after knight c5? Now, Magnus might be a patzer that gave up the bishop pair, but he's not going to be a patzer that gives up his second bishop too lightly here. So a move like bishop c4 you might think is very, very normal. And it is very, very normal, but it's not what Magnus decided to play. Turns out these 2800 players so much hate giving up these bishops for knights that Magnus decided he's going to give it up for a pawn instead and played bishop takes f7. Now, one of these moves wins and one of these moves loses. And despite the order I drew those arrows in, I want to ask you guys, which one wins and which one loses? And also, bonus points. What was Magnus's mistake in playing bishop takes f7? What did he miss? What did he miss here, chat room? So Randy says, I would think moving the king is bad, and that is what you would expect. But of course, king takes f7 wins the game, and queen takes f7 loses the game. Now, why is that? Well, knight takes e5 comes on the board, and you have a lot of problems that you need to solve with this queen here. If you move it to a safe square, you're going to get checked, and this king is stuck very much in the center of the board, which is not ideal. King e7 is met by knight g6, and king to d8 is met by knight f7, and king to d7 is illegal. All the other moves are illegal. So sad. So, of course, you should play king takes. Now, is this what Magnus Carlsen missed? No, probably Magnus Carlsen is good enough to think, yeah, king takes f7 is playable, but I have some kind of attack. Of course, what Magnus Carlsen missed is that Fabiano Caruana is a dirty calculator. All this guy does is calculate long forcing variations, and he's never wrong. Never in Fabiano Caruana's life has he calculated incorrectly, and that's almost true. And it turns out Fabi just calculated this one better than Magnus, and we're going to see him now go on to defend pretty much perfectly. And this is, again, not necessarily down to his good opening play, as many would tell you. Like, of course, Fabi had a great opening in this game against Magnus, equalized by like move 5 and had a slight advantage. Of course, why not continue launching an attack here? And it looks like Lichess actually gives it a question mark exclamation point bubble. This is like a new thing that Lichess has been doing. Lichess, I think, wanted you to play Rook takes f8 or something. I don't know. But Knight d3, not a bad move at all. We do get Queen takes d3 now by...
back up a few moves where the stream died for just a few moments.
Okay, do you know when?
4 moves ago. Sorry about that.
Was it here?
I think it was. Yeah, we're back.
Okay, we're back live. I think the stream died for a moment there. I was just talking about how great Fabiano Caruana is because he's such a dirty calculator. So Queen g5 in this position, and I was showing that Rook f8 check for white, King h7. Now Rook h8, by the way, is met by King g6, so Knight takes h8 instead. And it appears at the surface level that white is up in exchange here. And I was wondering that perhaps this is where Magnus stopped calculating, as I believe this is where many players might stop calculating. Maybe he saw that all the tactics don't quite work out for black. It's not like white's getting checkmated or anything. But then Fabi comes up with this nice move, bishop g4, attacking the rook on f8 and the queen on d1. At first glance, this looks quite strong, but of course there is this strange-looking move, queen to d3, but Fabi finds this nice follow-up with knight d3. And I was just talking about how these little question mark exclamation point bubbles are very new to me by Lichess. Okay, so back caught up to where I was. Knight d3, really interesting move by Fabi. And Magnus comes up with the move queen takes d3, which is probably correct. If Magnus had gotten greedy here and played something like rook takes a8, of course Fabi's point was that queen e3 check is going to be quite strong when you're going to be losing this queen or simply getting kind of destroyed and checkmated. I don't know if I see direct checkmate here. I guess knight takes e4 is somehow like mate in 7. This is a pretty simple plan to put the final nails in the coffin. So Fabi effectively defending this rook on a8 by playing knight d3. And this was enough to convince Magnus to give the exchange back. Now though, if we count the number of pieces on the board, black is fully even on material, down I believe 2 pawns. This knight on h8 has seen better days. So that's why we see Magnus taking on g4. You have to take this piece back, or else you're simply down the knight on h8. And now queen takes g4 by Fabi, because he's really mean. He's not going to take the knight because it's still trapped. We now see knight f3 by Magnus Carlsen, not yet really willing to give up on this attack. Queen g3 by Fabi, and before you know it, the material is back to even. Fabi miraculously finding all the tactics way in advance after bishop f7, and is now simply much better with the knight on h8 hanging on the next turn, material even, and believe it or not, the safer king after playing king takes f7, king g8, king h7. We do see e5 check by Magnus, forcing king takes h8, and now e6 by Magnus Carlsen, but this unfortunately is rolling over pretty quickly here. Fabi finds the accurate bishop b6 check. This king now has to step to h1. Really no other move. Queen g4 now is threatening some stuff. So we see queen to d6 trying to defend some stuff, of course with some normal move. Like rook e1 here, you're going to get, well, sorry, not queen h5 immediately, but rook takes f3 is sort of the nasty threat here with stuff like this going on. So we get queen d6, anticipating these types of queen checks, and also, by the way, attacking your rook and supporting your pawn. Simply rook d8 by Fabi forces this queen back, and now rook d5 has activated the rook, and checkmate is kind of coming. Queen b8 check, king h7. Magnus says, I'm going to go queen. Fabi says, that's fine, I calculated everything again. In this position, believe it or not, is actually black to move and win. And there's only one way to do it. Only one way to do it here. Only one way to win the game. And of course, that move is not rook h5 check. That loses. What's wrong with you? Why would you ever think that Fabi's plan with rook d8 to d5 was rook h5? Absolutely ridiculous. Of course, it's queen h5 check. Why is rook h5 wrong? Well, simply knight h2 by white, and you really don't have a good way to finish the job here. White is, believe it or not getting checkmated thanks to this queen on b8, and you don't have a good way to stop this pawn from promoting. And that's why we see the move queen h5 check. Now, if queen h2 were to be played, Fabi's going to take the slow approach, simply play queen to e8, and pick up this pawn in pretty short order here. Rook e1 is met by bishop f2, when you have to stay on the back rank, or else you face the wrath of rook d1, and rook f1 is actually losing your queen. And sorry, you might just be losing your queen here. But there is, I guess, knight h4. So bishop f2, and then rook h5, quite strong. So Magnus didn't like that, so Magnus chose knight h2 instead, but this actually loses a bit faster to rook d1 check when there's simply nothing to do here. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, knight f1. Now we get the queen check, king h2, and only a fool would expect Fabiano Caruana to have difficulties stopping queens and checkmating white, because after queen g1 check, Magnus Carlsen just resigns. No way to stop queen e3, and queen takes e7 on the following turn. And this is another game that Fabiano wins that demonstrated an entirely different skill set to game number one. Game number one, he just positionally crushed Levon Aronian and found the nice little combination to activate his final knight. And then here, he just outcalculates Magnus Carlsen pretty much effortlessly. Like he outplays him in the opening, sure, Fabi, great openings as usual. And then he just outcalculates Magnus Carlsen, finds every accurate move needed to win the game, and is not fazed at all by the bishop sacrifice in the opening, followed by being down in exchange for a few turns. Just does it with ease. So really impressive stuff by Fabi, showing an entirely different side of his opening play. And now I want to demonstrate a third aspect where Fabiano was doing really well in this tournament with the game against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So to recap, game one, excellent positional play, amazing positional understanding by Fabiano, just crushes Levon Aronian by shutting down Black's plans. Game number two, just destroys Magnus Carlsen straight out of the opening with amazing calculating abilities. And now game number three, we are going to demonstrate the psychological advantage Fabi had over all of his opponents once he had won like 6 games in a row. This was either game number 6 or 7 up against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and at this point everybody in the tournament is like looking at Fabi and they're just like, please don't hurt me, please don't hurt me. So we're gonna see MVL essentially just roll over in the face of Fabi here. Let's take a look. We have d4 by MVL. No more of this e4 stuff, okay? Fabi clearly knows what he's doing in e4. No Ruy Lopez's, no bishops openings, no Italians. We're playing d4 and drawing the game. I love it. Okay, so d5, c4. Fabi just plays very simply here with the QGD. We get knight c3, bishop e7, and this is a little bit of a weird move order, I think designed to prevent the QGD exchange with bishop g5. Of course, this prevents that by controlling the g5 square. So bishop g5 is just not a very good move here. But instead, MVL just plays bishop f4, which is also a very normal opening. We get knight f6 now, e3, castles, rook c1, knight b d7. Again, just very calm stuff so far. And then MVL decides to play c5 kind of randomly here. And this is something I did a lot as a 1400. I loved pushing my pawn to c5 and laughing at my opponents for not being able to control their dark squares. But as I got a little bit better at chess, I was always told, hey, this move's kind of bad, and we're going to see why that is in this game here. Now, is this the reason why MVL lost? No, but I do think this throws away any type of opening advantage that white might have. Now, why is c5 so bad? Well, there's sort of two reasons. Reason number one is it's generally not a bad idea for black to go a little bit crazy and just attack these pawns outright, although we'll see that is maybe not the best plan here. If you do want to go with b6, you might actually run into c6, and this is what 1400 me would love to do. Suddenly this knight is essentially just trapped, which is not ideal. So you can go c6 and sort of leave this plan in your back pocket, or you can do this other plan that Fabi enacts in the game, starting with knight e4. We get bishop d3 by MVL, now f5 by Fabi, and we get this kind of stonewall looking thing, but a really, really important part here is that white is already committed to c5. So it's going to be a lot better for black for one very specific reason, and that is control over the e5 square. Thanks to the lack of pressure the c5 pawn puts onto black's center, black is much more freely able to play the e5 break, and with it pretty much solve any opening problems you would have in a normal stonewall of activating this bishop. So that's the second reason why c5 is bad. You need this pressure on d5 to prevent really appealing breaks like e5 for black. Now we see knight f3 in the game, doing a good job of trying to control e5 regardless. c6 now by Fabi. We do get knight e5, bishop e5, but after bishop f6, we're going to see that this control over e5 is not meant to last for white. If you play something like f4, you're sort of asking for trouble with queen h4 check coming. And so MVL decides he's just going to give up on this dream of controlling e5 and takes f6. Now we see queen takes f6 by Fabi, knight e2 by MVL, and just e5. So once again, Fabi seizing a nice opening opportunity to solve all of his problems. c5 by MVL, a little bit on the weirder side, and Fabi understanding c5 comes with the downside of allowing the e5 break in many cases. Then I'm willing to bet, being the dirty calculator that he is, he got to somewhere around here in his mind and was like, yeah, I guess black is fine. Now we see the psychological pressure really taking its toll onto MVL here. Now, you guys in the chat room at home might be thinking, hey, why don't I castle my king? f2's attacked like a billion times. Like, I'm so scared that something bad is going to happen on f2. I got to castle my king. And you would be correct. You would be absolutely correct. You guys in the chat room might also be thinking, why don't I take on d4 and use this d4 square for my knight? That looks actually kind of appealing. And you would be right again. And furthermore, you guys in the chat room might even be thinking, why not play something like queen c2, maybe try to build up some pressure on this diagonal, and that would also be perfectly acceptable here for white. What you guys at home probably aren't thinking is, hey, why don't I play queen a4? And the good counter argument to why not play queen a4 is, why would you play queen a4? I don't understand what this move does, and I think this is just MVL sort of panicking against a really tough opponent in Fabiano Caruana with an unprecedented winning streak in this tournament. But yeah, queen a4 just doesn't do anything. It vaguely increases the pressure on the queen side. Maybe MVL was thinking I'll go b4, b5 or something. But of course, when you're staring down a lot of pieces looking at f2 with f4 breaks in the position, you got to be a little bit more cautious than queen a4, just putting the queen on the exact opposite side of the board. So I've been talking up this f2 pawn a lot. What does it actually mean that this pawn is weak? Well, it means we get moves like queen h4, and these moves are going to induce weaknesses from white's camp here. Theoretically, white could castle, but then you're actually going to be dealing with threats against the h-pawn as well, and it's sort of just free tempi for Fabi here. So instead we're going to see the move g3, trying to deal with the threat this way, but now of course g3 has made all sorts of other weaknesses in white's camp. Queen g4 by Fabi, and then weird move number 2, rook f1. So at this point, I understand not wanting to castle, having just played the move g3, but but rook f1 is just a bit too afraid. It's a bit too afraid of Fabi. We needed to bring this queen back into the game. Why is this queen on a4? Nobody knows. Bring it back to like literally any square and it's better placed. Instead we get rook f1, and now of course Fabi has an advantage and he's going to play perfectly until he wins, and he does so with knight g5, just immediately taking advantage of all these weak squares in white's camp, and the end is already near for MVL. We see king d2 in the game, knight f3 check, king c3, h2 falls, rook h1, knight back to f3. And I could say the rest is history, but that would deprive you guys of a very entertaining king hunt that Fabi goes on here. So now you might be thinking, what's better than the a4 square for the queen? And if you came up with the a5 square, then you're thinking like MVL. And I don't know if this was his initial intention with queen a4. It's a very strange one to just try and invade on the c7 square, but this is the idea he came up with in the game. At this point, you can't really fault him. There's just no good moves in this position for white. There's just nothing good you can do. So queen a5, why not? Fabi now plays the move queen to g5, applying a little bit of pressure to these dark squares. We see d takes e5 by MVL, and simply queen e7 now stops queen c7 and is ready to capture on e5 with either piece. Knight d4 by MVL, simply knight takes e5, and c5 is also weak. We get b3 by MVL, another sort of mystery move here. b3, don't know what the idea was. Maybe he's afraid of knight c4 or something, but again, I think this is just the psychological edge showing its stuff here. Like, I don't think MVL plays b3 against a 2400 international master. I'll say that much. I think you only play b3 against, so far 3,000 plus performance Fabiano Caruana, because you're like, I don't see how knight c4 kills me, but Fabi just played knight e5. I gotta stop knight c4. I think that's what's going on. All right, so b3 and now b6 is the correct idea by Fabi, because of course it is. C takes b and simply c5, and immediately any sense of safety you had with this king is just entirely gone. MVL tries to save this knight. We get bishop b7 now, activating the final piece and making threats. B takes a7, d4 check attacks this king. E takes d4, and now Fabi first trades off these pieces, simply takes on h1. By the way, you can't even take back. That's just so sad. Instead, we get rook takes c5, and Fabi now up a rook goes about the process of checkmating the white king by driving it up the board and just really mercilessly bringing in the rooks and ending the game here. Not even rook takes b6, by the way. Like, how mean do you have to be to not play rook takes b6 here? You have to be pretty mean. We get queen d3 check and queen d5 check instead. And this is where MVL decided to throw in the towel. Of course, if you try something like rook c6, the simplest is perhaps just to take everything and take on a7 here when you have no way to save your queen. So this is perhaps the third aspect of the game where Fabiano was incredibly crushing everyone he came across. Psychologically, by calculation, by positional understanding, Fabi really had it all in 2014, and probably still has those skills today. All right, we do have some time left, and so there's one more game I want to go over with you guys, even if we only have a few minutes to do so, and that is the game against Veselin Topalov from the same tournament. So Topalov, a lot of you guys who are just getting into chess might not know, but this guy was a beast in the 2000s and going into the mid-2010s as well. You see a lot less of him these days. I think he might be one of those technically retired players who still comes out to play some events, but very strong guy. Played against Vachier-Lagrave for the World Championship and very nearly won it. And this is his game against Fabiano Caruana. So let's take a look. We have Fabi playing e4, and Topalov's a smart guy. He sees what's happening to Levon Aronian in e4, e5. So he very cleverly says, ha, I will play the Sicilian defense. I'll have none of that, please. We get knight f3, e6, d4, takes, knight c6, knight c3 by Fabi, a6, and we get knight takes c6, b takes c6. And so with this change in structure, we see Fabi going for a pretty interesting type of position against the Sicilian here. So whenever you play knight takes c6 in the Sicilian, a lot of you guys, maybe as beginners, are told this move's not very good because it builds black's center up and allows for an easy d5. But we're going to see that Fabi has something in mind against it. We have bishop d3 by Fabi, now d5, castles, knight f6, rook e1, bishop e7, and e5. Okay, so knight d7 now. And what we have in this instance is something kind of similar to game one here. Fabi is essentially cutting the board in half with a closed center. And we saw him do this against Levon Aronian in game one because the king side was just a more advantageous side of the board for white with all those weaknesses he had forced in the opening. And now Fabi does it again with e5 here. So we see the immediate queen g4. And rather than the preventative approach that we saw against Levon Aronian, Fabi's just sort of taking the initiative here and attacking on the king's side before black is ready. We get king f8 by black. Of course, castles would be a pretty big blunder due to bishop h6, so king f8 is not so unusual. Now knight a4 by Fabi Caruana is keeping an eye on some of these weaker dark squares, and of course freeing the way for the c-pawn if c4 or c3 is ever needed. Queen a5 by black. Don't forget, queens move sideways, so we haven't blundered just yet. Rook e2 by Fabi is a decent move, just getting the rook out of the threat of capture. h5 tries to interrupt this connection, but we just see queen to f4. g5 now continues to try to shake this queen loose from the knight, and here we're going to see bishop d2, which is really the only move for white. Queen c7 now by Topalov. If you do play g takes f4, perhaps this endgame is okay for black, but you have just made quite a few weaknesses on the king side with your h5, g5 nonsense. So we see Topalov saving the queen instead and trying to use this space to launch some kind of attack. Queen g3, h4, queen g4, and now rook g8. And after this move, Topalov is unfortunately already kind of busted here. We see Fabi just play rook a to e1, c5, and now this c4 move does come in handy. This was a large reason why this knight was moved to a4. You want to be able to contest any sort of massive center like the c5 and d5 pawns, and you do so here with white by playing the move c4. D takes c4 is Topalov's choice rather than the move d4, which does come with some problems here. So instead d takes c4, opening up this diagonal and trying to draw white's bishop away from the nasty attacking diagonal of b1 to h7. We see bishop b7 now, simply h3 by Fabi, really taking his time here, making sure there's no threats with pawn to h3 by black. Rook d8, bishop c3, knight b8, rook e3, and knight c6. So Topalov is just rerouting the pieces, pretending everything is normal and attacking the center. But of course, Fabi's not going to miss a chance to attack the black king here. So white to move and win in this position. White kind of has a small positional edge, regardless of what you do here, but Fabi found the best way forward. So go ahead and try to find it. Try to find it at home with our last few minutes. Of course, the answer here is to continue sacrificing. Bishop takes e6. All Fabi does is outcalculate opponents and sacrifice pieces rather fearlessly. And yet again, this is just another game, all from this one tournament, that probably belongs in a best games collection. Fabi was just blasting out these best games of all time back in this 2014 Sinquefield Cup. We get f takes e6 by Topalov, rook f3 check, king e8, and now simply queen takes e6. This king is stuck in the center of the board, this rook is undefended, and the white pieces are all sort of looming in the position. Rook g7 is what Topalov tried, but now queen h6, and this rook is kind of just trapped. Knight d4 was played in the game, going for counterplay, but now e6, and it's all so nasty. It's all so nasty, this stuff. We get knight takes f3 with check, Fabi just recaptures, and now bishop f8 tries to keep everything together, but queen h5 check, king e7. and bishop takes g7 was enough for Topalov to resign. Of course, if you capture this bishop, you're going to get checked, and e7, e8 is just making a second queen for white. And by the way, white's only down one piece in this position, so it's not like white has had to sacrifice a whole ton of material to get here. And so I kind of zipped through this game, but the point I just wanted to show is that how easily Fabi is making these games like look just completely winning. Like, Topalov, legendary player, and played a pretty reasonable game here. There were some strange stuff like this h5 and g5 stuff, this rook g8 move, king f8 in the opening. Definitely opened the door for Fabi, but then not wasting any time. Fabi just sits on the position until there's one chance for a knockout punch, and then immediately he capitalizes and just wins the game rather effortlessly. And that is the story of this whole tournament. Fabi making the top 10 grandmasters of the day, looking like weak GMs, just absolutely dominating them in every facet of the game. Positional understanding, tactical calculation, taking your opportunities, and even psychologically, as we kind of saw against MVL. Not MVL's best game, but Fabi, again, just on an absolute tear in 2014. Now, by the way, if you are new to the St. Louis Chess Club, we are still hosting the Sinquefield Cup, and this year's was just announced a little bit ago, so I recommend staying tuned to our events in the upcoming year. The Sinquefield Cup, just one of many we're hoping to have in the late summer going into fall. Will we see Fabi ever do a repeat showing of his feat here in 2014? I certainly hope so. That's going to do it for us here tonight on the Road to 2000. I want to thank you guys very much for watching. If you're watching live, we actually do have a lecture with Grandmaster Steven Zierk coming up right after this, so look for that on the same channel. And as always, I will see you next time.